This is quite the story. Is it good though? Is Dracula really alive? Let's talk about it. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Movie Emporium's movie review of Abraham's Boys, a Dracula story, directed by Natasha Kermani. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, premiering on, of course, Shudder, Abraham's Boys is the story of Abraham Van Helsing, who has left, of course, England after the Dracula situation. He now has two boys with Mina Van Helsing, and they live in the 1915s United States countryside, where they are living in seclusion, hopefully never to be approached by Dracula. Well, this story is basically what would happen if those demons, the past, the possibility of Dracula found its way to the United States and started to infect the mother of these two young kids, as well as the kind of nature of who Abraham Van Helsing is, and what do you do in that scenario. So it's basically a continuation story from writer, of course, Joe Hill, about what would happen if like Abraham Van Helsing came to America and the past came up to him. So with that said, Abraham's Boys was a movie I've never heard of before. That is usually pretty standard when it comes to Shudder. A lot of these films don't really have a lot of marketing behind it. It's not saying that they're not anticipated or they're not something that you would look forward to. I'm just saying that a lot of these times you've never heard of these movies. And it's surprising because Joe Hill is a prominent writer, Nosferatu, The Black Phone, and stuff like that. So when it comes to this movie and it having like Titus Welliver in it and stuff like that, I was curious. I was interested. I love the idea of Abraham Van Helsing. I like that idea of the Dracula story about his fight against, the darkness and the nature of war and the nature of like what Dracula represents. So bringing it to America and having it deal with the inner demons of Abraham Van Helsing and the possibility of the horrors that are like following in behind him, seems like an interesting idea. And so with that said, going into this movie, you got to understand that this is a more low key, more low budget, doesn't really deal with like the Dracula storyline outside of having Van Helsing in it. And so therefore, my honest opinion of this movie is it's very slow burn. It's very methodical. It doesn't really deal with a lot of the nature of like the Dracula storyline, but it deals with the nature, and it does it actually pretty well with the nature of what it is like to have your demons follow you and then kind of coerce itself into your offspring, into the nature of who you are. So therefore, it's a really interesting story, and it actually leads open to a lot of questions about what did Abraham Van Helsing really experience, and is the stuff he's experiencing really affecting his mental state? And now that he's much older and has kids, how's that pushing off onto his kids themselves? So therefore, it's a really interesting story. Once again, it's very slow, it's very methodical, it doesn't have a lot of horror elements, even though it's a horror story, but it is a very interesting story about the nature of like abuse and the nature of situations when it comes to who we are and how it affects our mental health and stuff like that. And I think Titus Welliver, who plays Abraham Van Helsing, is actually really good in this movie. I think his kids, who are played by Brady Hepner and Juda Mackey, are actually really interesting to watch because they're having to do most of the heavy lifting, because they're technically almost like the main characters of the story. Abraham Van Helsing is kind of like the father, and it's dealing with a lot of his psychosis and stuff like that. And then you have, of course, Jocelin Donahue, who plays Mina Van Helsing, who is dealing with a sickness that could possibly be the vampire curse and stuff like that. I really like the idea of taking what we know from Bram Stokers like storylines and his like how he wrote his story, and taking it and moving and pushing it further into the nature of what that story represents, which is the nature of like the darkness of the human mind and the human culture, and how the nature of everything that affects the world when it becomes like chaotic and when it becomes toxic and stuff like that. And that takes its place onto this movie. And I love it's a very beautiful movie to look at because of how it deals with 1950s. I like the fact that the railroad system is coming in is like an effect on like how the world is like closing in on itself, which is also a kind of motif of Dracula, how everything is starting to kind of compact and like destroy its own self and stuff like that. I just really like what that does and what it does here, and therefore it's only 4 characters. Some other characters come into the mix, but it really feels like a story about just like the mentality of who we are as we grow and as we become older, and how does that affect the people that we love. And it's just a really fascinating movie. It really is. It's not a movie that's gonna be for everyone, one, but you know, it's a movie that I really think gets a sense of like what makes Dracula, what makes that story sense work, and therefore I really enjoyed this movie. I really did. Is it the best movie I've ever seen? No. Is it the greatest horror movie I've ever seen? No. I like the idea that, you know, it is more tension filled than it is horrifying. I like the idea that, you know, the director Natasha Kermani just gives us really cool kind of visuals. You know, we see what could be Dracula or Nosferatu or whatever they're working on, and it goes beyond that. It goes just like to, is that something you're really seeing, or is that something that's affecting who you are? It also brings into account of like, is the Dracula story real? Because it brings in another character to kind of make that question. And it really is just an interesting kind of take on the whole story that Bram Stoker brought up. And I know I've repeated that, but it's kind of just something I have to instill upon what this movie is. But it's an interesting movie. You know, Brady Hepner, who plays the older brother of the two, really has to like instill upon the story, and instill upon the idea of who he is, because he's brought into this world by a guy who was affected by something traumatic. And he has to, like, you know, protect his younger brother and protect his mother from something that could be a very abusive situation. And I really think that Brady Hepner he carries a lot of this movie and does a really nice job and has a really interesting conclusion, because it doesn't go exactly where you think it's going to go. It doesn't go exactly where you think it's going to be in the end. And I think it does a really nice job. So overall, Abraham's Boys is a slow burn, slow style horror film that is more about the tone and the feel than it is about the actual imagery and stuff like that. And I think it works on that level. It's not going to be for everyone. Once again, it's going to be a movie that you find boring. There is some parts in this movie where I'm just like, you gotta, you know, even though for 85 minutes, it's like, you gotta move forward. But I think overall, I really enjoyed this movie. So overall, Abraham's Boys, good recommend. I really enjoyed it. So there you go. Anyways, with that said, that is going to be my take on Abraham's Boys. For some reason, it has a Dracula story in it. So I don't know. Just look for Abraham's Boys. You'll find it there. But in the comments below, what do you think of the Dracula story? What do you think about this expansion onto the Dracula story? Do you think it's interesting? Do you have any interest in seeing it? Once again, it'll be on Shudder on July 11th. So let me know. But otherwise, if you like what you see on this channel, awesome. Hit the subscribe button to join Movie Emporium. Hit that notification bell, top to find what's coming next. If you like this video, awesome. Hit that like button. And as always, we'll see you guys on the next video. Peace out, guys.